dark here, and I just realized how much it looks like I'm just sitting in a cave.
No, no, the
So,
lighting's good, man. That's sweet. Doesn't look creepy at all.
well, that's better than I do most of the time. So,
Oh, no, we're actually live. Let me re-intro it and then we'll get started.
sounds good.
All right, guys, here we are. I've screwed up again, the second time in the podcast. I promised myself I wouldn't do this again and mismatch time zones, but I've done it, and I've done it to someone who, ideally, I wanted him to respect me. Maybe one day he'll show the real. Now he knows we can't even nail the basics. We're going to try to get into some complex strength and conditioning concepts, and we can't even get the time zones right. This is a fucking shit show. It's episode 144, and we've got Dobbs from Compound Training. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us. I wasn't even going to tell people, man. You let the cat out of the bag yourself.
I'll try to win you back over again. There's two things we pride ourselves on this show. It's honesty and not fact-checking.
Perfect. Perfect.
Exactly. All right, so I want to say I think I started following you a good while ago. I think Will Crozier got us onto him because he was showing me some of the breathing stuff, and he said he's done a bit of work with you.
Yep.
And obviously, I've been training with John Evans, so I'm very into the ISOs for sort of knee health. I do a lot of those, and I found Jake Tura, and he was shouting out some of his shit, and that was
Yeah.
really good. And I started sort of following along with that. And I've got to say, since I've been doing a bit of the breath work, and again, this is sort of 2 or 3 things I learned from Will, which he got through himself and a few other guys, and the Jake Tura ISO holds. And I haven't stretched sort of statically or even foam rolled or done any myofascial release, and my body's feeling better than ever. So I got to give you
Yeah.
credit to that, and that's what I want to talk about today. And I know Angus is probably the same. That's in line with what I want to talk about. So I guess,
All right.
how long have you been doing a lot of this breath work for, and the rib cage dysfunction stuff for, and how did you get into it?
So I started, man, it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago at this point. I started working at Peak Performance with Pat Davidson and a few other guys, the Resilient Physical Therapy team. And that was really my introduction to the PRI principles in general. And same thing. It completely changed the way that I look at the human body. It definitely changed my own personal health. I'm the classic story of a collegiate athlete who went through multiple injuries and never really had a career and just kind of lived through my 20s in fairly chronic pain and was doing everything right. Like I was doing the banded distraction, I was doing the foam rolling, I was doing the stretching. I got into FRC and some of those things for a while. And once I really started looking at kind of respiration and using it as a way to reposition and reorientate myself, um, I really just started feeling better about everything, right? And there's a few different pathways that probably comes from or stems from. We could definitely go deeper into both of those, but the tendon stuff is actually stuff that I'd come across more recently. I think you actually had Ben Patrick on your own show, correct? Yeah. So he's a guy that I heard speaking on Just Fly Performance not that long ago, really, and kind of started looking more into his stuff and was already playing with some of those principles in general. I've got a few buddies who are really into just movement, and they do a lot of calisthenics and they do a lot of sissy squats and things of that nature, just stuff that I really was never doing in a classic strength and conditioning format, right? We're always talking, vertical shins and asses back and all that good, chest out and all that good stuff. And so just kind of thinking about different ways of going about movement and realizing just how kind of structurally frail that I was as I went through that. So kind of got in with him, started talking to Jake. Jake and I have been following each other for a long time, but I hadn't really communicated with him that much until I started asking him more questions about this stuff. David Gray is another guy who had a fantastic podcast on it. Dr. Tommy John had a really good one as well. So they've had several of those guys on there. And I started noticing some crossovers from a positional standpoint between some of the more classical PRI stances and some of these, I guess, principles as well. So started looking at kind of combining them as much as I could and trying to find overlap. And Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat you are, where I'm 36, right? So I'm I'm pretty old at this point, especially from an athletic standpoint, and I feel better than I did when I was 24 by a lot, and that's great for me.
Let's tell
So
that to Justin Gatlin. He's 37 and he's the worst dancer.
What?
I got to say, exactly the guys you referenced there, added John Evans, who is my coach at the moment. I do a bit of athletic work with. You guys have been the biggest sort of influence on how I train people and how I train myself in sort of, I would say, like the last year.
Well, it's been I feel like there's almost a big renaissance or a shift that's sort of bubbling away, and it's like sort of started in the S&C field, but I can see a lot of this stuff. Like me and Oscar both work a lot with the general population, like people in their 40s and 50s who are just trying to live a more pain-free life as they go about, their work day and things like that. And like a lot of this stuff I find super valuable for them as well. But it was all of these concepts that I was initially really scared of, just because I think everyone in fitness's first exposure to focus on breathing came from some idiot functional guru sort of like, because I like Wim Hof, and like I think anyone who's paying attention to breath, like that's really cool. But then like this just seems like it's a bit more thought out.
yeah, and it's amazing because when I first got into it, I really started looking because for me, I've been in the industry for a long time. I'm going on almost 15 years in the industry, and I came out of school and I was a pre-med major. I got my CSCS and then I went into like the SFMA FMS route, and that was kind of what was out at the time, and went through like the NASM CPT. I did the ACSM, so I've kind of gone through all of the major kind of the big box certs, and then got into FRC and some other things. And what I've always looked at with this is, they're all tools, right? So I try to find similarities between all the systems, and that's what I really look for, because if I see things that, kind of spread across multiple systems and then even maybe systems outside of fitness, those are things that I want to look deeper into, and as soon as I see something that is one belief system or one system specific, that's when red flags kind of start going up for me. And I have to be a little more critical and a little more objective about how I go about, looking at that. And for me, it's like when you look at breath, right? Because one of the biggest benefits of PRI is, dampening the autonomic nervous system, right? So we look at creating more of a parasympathetic state through respiration so that we can open up movement quality and movement capacity. And when you look at even really classic movement principles, like you look at yoga, you look at Tai Chi, you look at Qigong, you look at things that have been around for literally thousands of years, and breathing is a primary staple within all of those, I guess, arts almost at that point. And then you look at things like meditation and even prayer, right? And you look at some of the positions that people are in, and you see more of a kyphotic, upper spine. You see more breathing. You see people breathing into their posterior rib cage and more focus on breathing. And at that point, it's like, humans are pretty inherently, intelligent. We stumble across a lot of things over time. And all this stuff is centuries old, right? When you start looking at it from that perspective. So I think PRI is kind of the first system that's really tried to bring it into, fitness, quote unquote, from that standpoint. And that's where I kind of got more locked into it, is because it just started making more sense to me based on the other things that I've looked at over the time.
How wild then does it seem, reflecting on that age-old wisdom in strength and conditioning, to recover, to place the hands on the back of the head and throw yourself into that sort of ribs flared, extended posture
Yeah.
In between rounds or at halftime or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Just
silly.
compress that rib cage, right? And limit your actual respiration. It's funny because I'm a guy that I ran track through the collegiate level, and then I've done a lot of competitive indoor rowing. I know you guys do a lot of outdoor rowing as well. And when you look at aerobic athletes, right, and you look at how they recover, right, it's hands on the knees, it's rib cage retracted. When you look at rowers and when they release back in, that's what you see a lot of too, right? Protracted scapulas, retracted rib cage. When you look at cyclists who are coasting on their bike, you see that big kind of flex spine, right? And when you start seeing all of these patterns, right, because really it's all strategies. And the more stress that we accumulate, the more you'll fall into the strategy that your body will, knows best, right? So when you see people start fatiguing as stress accumulates in any sport, you start seeing the body naturally adapt certain postures. And it doesn't do that because it's tired in the respect for aerobic athletes as much as it does that because your body's desperately trying to get air into your lungs. So it adopts the position that it can best utilize for that task, right? And that is that, again, just following the curvature of the spine. You look at that kyphotic thoracic spine going into kind of a little more lordotic lumbar spine, and we're like that for a reason, right? And I think if you just watch athletes who've never been coached, or if you watch children when they're playing sports up and through like the middle school, high school level, and you start seeing what they do without really thinking about it, kind of subcortically or subconsciously, you can probably pick up a lot more cues than you would going to a lot of these seminars. And I think that's something that, coaches in general really need to just understand is, subconsciously or autonomically, our bodies will find a way to achieve a task. And if you can't breathe, the postures that you fall into are probably going to dictate better respiration.
Yeah. I don't know. I had a good segue into this question, but I forgot it.
I guess from a generic trainer at the moment, like you were saying, your clients fatigue, you say get up tall, try and breathe in the lungs. Let's sort of really take a stereotype there of your general trainer, right? Saying they don't know anything we're discussing. What would be the first thing or the first few things you would teach them when it comes to breath work? Like basic level stuff, entry level stuff.
I think that a big thing is I think a lot of trainers don't understand that the rib cage has to expand and contract, right? I don't think people see the rib cage as a bunch of joints as much as they think of it as
until about 3 months ago.
Yeah, you just think of it as a cage, right? That kind of protects things, but we don't necessarily think of it as like a pump.
Yeah.
And the way you have to think about your rib cage is it's literally a pump. And it expands and it contracts. It internally rotates, externally rotates. It does all the things that a lot of other joints do. And when you're standing in that kind of hands behind the head posture, as upright as possible with that thoracic extension, you're actually constricting the rib cage with your scapulas, with your lats. And it's actually decreasing your ability to take air in. At that point, right? You can't expand it because you've got your muscles literally tightening it up.
And especially with so many people, like me and Oscar work in the fat loss sphere, everyone's so obsessed with like pulling in. And you see these people when they inhale, they pull all their lower abdominals in because they're trying to flatten out that stomach, and they're never letting that go. And there's just so much tone in that area.
Yeah. And that's just, again, the hypertonicity of kind of how we've been taught to posture ourselves just on a daily basis. And again, I'm not on a pedestal here. Before PRI, even 5 years ago, I was very much in the same boat where for me, it's like everything was chest out, packed scapulas, right? And I was in that same extension pattern everybody else is.
Even going back to school, I'm not sure if it was the same in America, but the teachers would be like, when you're sitting on the floor, legs crossed, which I think is great, but it's like sit up tall, chest up. Like whoever can sit the straightest gets a prize or gets lollies or whatever.
This idea that the spine isn't meant to be in a flexed position.
Yeah,
and it's still extremely new for Angus and I. And I guess that's why we're so keen to get you on, is to learn why and learn more of the ins and outs. And I got to say, you do a great job of explaining stuff on Instagram. You're also very philosophical as well.
About every 10th post, I'll try to post something that philosophically based, and it gets about half the likes and response of talking about, hamstrings. So I go right back to hamstrings just for engagement purposes. But I think it's one of those things where, the same people that teach that upright spine are also teaching variability, right? But they're actually doing the exact opposite. They're just letting that pendulum swing into the other side and looking at, extension based or concentrically based orientations rather than flexion based. And should you be slumping all the way over a desk? Like, absolutely not. Like, that's probably not a great thing. We don't want to necessarily hang out at the end ranges of either extension or flexion, right? Most of the time. We just want to be able to access them if we need them. And I think that's the biggest thing is, the spine is literally just made up of joints, right? And it's meant to bend and rotate and do a lot of different things. And part of your vertebrae are meant to flex and extend. Part of them are meant to rotate, right? And when we're locking up and we're getting rigid and we're trying to stand up straight, we're actually decreasing our variability and creating a more fragile kind of structure, right? We're being rigid, and rigid things break, where, again, mobile things don't nearly as easy. And I think that's very problematic. And, for me, even before PRI, when I started really trying to explore these things and even got more into FRC, right? One of my very own clients was like, yeah, but try to throw a baseball with your scapulas packed. And I'm just like, oh, yeah. I started looking, I'm like, wow, you really don't do anything athletic with your rib cage pulled back together, right?
A bunch of powerlifters are seriously offended right now.
Yeah, we're going to see a lot of rounded-shouldered deadlifts and benches.
I love though how you reference that swinging pendulum though, because that's the exact presentation I see when a lot of clients come in off the street. They're too kyphotic, their shoulders are too forward, and then we do so much thoracic extension and so much bench pressing and so much packing down of the shoulder blades, and then we need to go pull them back the other way. So I guess, are you sort of saying that the solution is to always have aspects of all this movement, like explore every ability of the body, and then that leads to the most neutral person? Or are there always strategies that we need to employ to return someone to neutral, as they say, even if you are always focusing on flexing and extending, pronating, supinating, going through all the positions?
I think this is where strength comes in for a lot of people. And when I see, Gen Pop people that are just really exhibiting or expressing that extreme kyphotic posture, they're usually just also not very strong
anywhere.
And yeah, right. And as we start actually training, I try to get them in a more neutral posture, because again, they're not neutral either. They're just hanging out on the other extreme. So I try to get them in a little more neutral, posture while we're going through the movements that they're able to do. And as we start building up base strength, they usually typically hold themselves better, right? And I even think this is also, it delves down the rabbit hole of, performance versus health and that continuum, where they're not the same thing. And because of that, you are going to have different postures. And powerlifting is a perfect example of that, right? And I tell people all the time, I was a 400 runner, right? And I've been around a lot of sprinters and a lot of high level ones. And you go watch any 100-meter, championship at any race, and all you see is anterior pelvic tilts and sagittalized athletes, right? And people that are very extension based. If you see a power lifter working through a max deadlift or a max squat or a max bench, you see a lot of extension. If you see a basketball athlete doing a max vertical, you'll never see it with a neutral pelvis and rib cage, right? To be able to potentiate, right, and express power, you have to be able to go through supination, abduction, right, adduction, external rotation, and extension. And you just don't want to be stuck there. And that's where you get a lot of problems with athletes, with just overuse injuries and the people that kind of just feel like shit anytime they're not actually doing their sport, right? Like most power lifters aren't in pain when they're lifting as much as they are when they're not.
Yes, exactly.
And that's where, when I'm working with a power lifter, in this example, like when I'm talking to William, right, what we're talking about is I'm not changing his setup for a squat, deadlift, or bench. Like, we're not messing with those things unless he's in acute pain during them. We're talking about things that he can do from a sensorial standpoint to gain variability outside of the gym, right? When he's taking a walk, or when he's, hanging out with his friends or whatever, training clients even.
Is this where
just standing up?
Is this where the term refilling the well comes from?
That's definitely a concept, and that's how it applies to this, right? Where you've got people that are so concentrically oriented, that's also going to feed into their autonomic standpoint, because when you're concentrically orientated, you're also usually very hyperactive from an autonomic standpoint. So you're in that kind of hypervigilant sympathetic state, right? The fight or flight state. And when you're doing that, your body is utilizing much more energy, right? Your resting heart rate goes up, your core body temperature goes up, your blood pressure goes up. and you're just again, you're expending energy at a pretty high rate. Meanwhile, you're also decreasing immune health, digestion, movement, planar mechanics, things of that nature, because libido, right? Even appetite, right? Because your body doesn't care about those things if it thinks it's running from a lion, right? You're just trying to get away. Like it doesn't care about procreation, your next meal. It cares about running from whatever's chasing you. So that's a very, that's something, I always recommend new trainers, once they kind of go through a few courses, like read Sapolsky, go watch his YouTube lectures, read Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and try to gain a better understanding of just the autonomic system in general, and understand how to manipulate it for training and lifestyle purposes. And you're going to have a much healthier client and athlete overall from a global perspective.
It is interesting because there are so many like nature fallacies that people try to drag into fitness, but that whole fight or flight, like running from a bear metaphor, seems to be one of those things that does hold very, very true. We need to get ourselves out of that stress state from time to time and just calm the body.
Yeah,
definitely. And something that is very prevalent in Australia at the moment, it seems like people have a real issue with calling themselves personal trainers, and I've seen like holistic life coaches, energy alignment coaches, and they know nothing about what you're talking about right now. They just think they're like a sort of Joe Rogan type in the fitness industry, trying to motivate people or tell people how to be happy.
But when it's underpinned by the anatomy like that.
Yeah, exactly right. No, but that's what I'm saying. It gives it more substance. And I feel like you're more of the holistic coach, but it seems like you have no issue being just a personal trainer, which I think is great.
Yeah, man. It's just like you kind of got to know what you are. And at the end of the day, from a coaching perspective, I'm not trying to impress my peers as much as I'm trying to resonate with the people that I can actually help. Right. And that's even where like the social media thing comes in, is so many trainers out there, or, holistic coaches or movement specialists, whatever they want to call themselves. They spend the entirety of their social media presence talking to their peers. Right. And not only just their peers, but typically their peers that are in their actual belief systems, because we're also very tribal by nature. Right. So PRI people talk to PRI people, and their photos get liked by other PRI people. Meanwhile, the man or woman that just feels like shit and is following their page because they're a rehab specialist, quote unquote, is trying to figure out what the fucking AICBC pattern is, right? Or what a posterior mediastinum is.
Yeah,
or
look, I can't lie. I'm trying to figure out that as well.
I actually want to get into one of these acronyms in particular in a second.
Yeah, so I mean that's the big thing, right? Is so I try not to use jargon. I try not to use acronyms as much as possible, because I actually want to help people, right? And I think there's a lot of, either consciously or subconsciously, there's a lot of kind of validation by confusion that really runs rampant in the industry, right? And people have to validate their pricing, or they have to validate their worth professionally by creating dependence and confusion with their client base. And for me, like that's just bullshit, right? And I was the young trainer that was really probably self-conscious early on in my career. And I definitely, vomited physiology on a bunch of just really well-intentioned clients that could care less about any of that shit, right? They just wanted to lose a little bit of weight or get stronger. And you'd see their eyes glaze over, and you'd maybe never see them again or whatever, right? But now looking back, it's like now I'm just seeing the same thing from a different view, right? And that's where, even with what I do professionally now, I work with a lot of trainers, and that's a lot of what we talk about is, there's a big difference between speaking with your peers and trying to educate yourself, and then speaking with your clients and trying to educate them, right? And I think empower, what you just said, is probably the biggest thing. Is like, I'm not here to educate a client unless they're actually asking me why. I'm here to empower them, engage them, encourage them. I want them to actually start, considering fitness something they enjoy doing, right? I'm just trying to build frequency and adherence, right? And then lifestyle coherence, and then, physiological changes will happen down the road. But I have to play, the behavioral psych game before I ever get into actual weight loss or strength gain, right? So I'm also big on like the biopsychosocial model, where you have to talk to them about stuff besides just skeletal muscle, right? And position. And half of my clients think a 90-90 hip lift is a glute exercise and a bear position plank is an ab exercise. They just do it for breaths instead of me counting seconds. And I just let them keep believing that, because early in my PRI career, again, I had a client in a bear position that was like, oh, I really feel my abs. This is great, right? I'm like, well, you're actually supposed to be breathing into your posterior rib cage. And are you feeling that? And they're like, oh, shit. They lost all interest in doing the exercise once I told them it wasn't an ab exercise. So who'd I help, right? At that point, now I don't have the intention behind actually doing it. And especially the PRI stuff, it's so nuanced, that's right? That you have,
what you described there is exactly what I felt like, the obligation to sort of like guide the client through the experience. And I did the same thing. I just ruined the 90-90 hip lift for him. So I use it. So I take 2 HIIT classes a week, and it's HIIT class. People are there to get a sweat up, but I try and sneak this stuff in at the end. So what I do is I say, look, 5 minutes. I say, we're going to relax. And that's all I sell it as. And we go into the 90-90 hip lift position. I turn the lights off. I explain it to them. I don't even tell them what it's doing. I'm like, you'll feel great when you finish this. And at the end, they're relaxed because that calms their breath down. So if anything, that's how I sort of sell it to them. And a few guys that are in my class actually listen to this, so I hope it doesn't ruin it for them. But just, guys, listen to Kyle. It's great for you.
No, but this is where it's valuable, though, because all you're doing is encouraging you, I should say, a parasympathetic shift and dampening the autonomics post-session, right? And here's what people don't understand. When you're sympathetic, you're not producing growth hormone or testosterone as a male. You're not producing that unless you're in a parasympathetic state at a rate that's actually going to help you build skeletal muscle. And that's why, we always tell people that they recover when they sleep. That's when you're the most parasympathetic, right? So if you've got clients who take that HIIT class and they never calm down and they just go throughout their day vigilant and elevated, they're not doing themselves any good with the gains either, right? So they're not metabolizing food the right way. They're not producing the hormonal output that's actually going to help them. They're not actually getting the recovery that's going to build muscle. And, if they're looking to lose weight, burn fat, right? Because when you're sympathetic, you're also pumping out cortisol at the highest rate possible.
But we've got this culture in general pop fitness, especially in Australia right now, where people wake up, their alarm goes off, and they're straight into a HIIT F45 class,
being
just
on Instagram
drilling themselves straight into the office in front of a computer, wife's texting them through the phone, bosses yelling at them over the shoulder, and they just start their day with just this big ball of stress, and it just seems like a downward slide from there.
See a lot of my clients are the bosses doing the yelling, and then they're still stressed. And they're in that kyphotic position doing the yelling.
Hopefully they're reaching with their point and getting some nice protraction, slide that scap across the rib cage.
It's funny because they're probably the most stressed, right? And that's another Sapolsky study when he looked at apes. The second male in command was usually the most stressed. So it's like your mid-level manager. It's like shit runs downhill from that point on, right? Because they're the biggest threat to the big guy.
Just conducting all the stress through them. Can you stop?
Oh, that happens so much.
That's happened twice in yesterday's monthly wrap-up.
No, but it's I worked in New York for 13 years, right? So I was in it, and that's where, again, if you read books like, Polyvagal Theory or The Upside of Stress or How Emotions Are Made and some of these other things, you start realizing that, stress isn't inherently bad, right? We can't adapt without stress. So we need it in our lives. And the biggest factor on whether you get a positive adaptation or a detrimental one with stress is actually your perception of the stressor itself. And that's kind of the difference between eustress and distress, right? And The Upside of Stress is a book that I recommend to everybody. It's Kelly McDonald. She was a Stanford researcher that really dove deep into this. And she's someone that, as they were conducting research, they actually started noticing different hormonal outputs based on somebody's perception of the stressor, right? The stressor is never the issue. And something that I talk about with a lot of my people is, think about skydiving. We're jumping out of a plane, right? Well, one of my really good friends who I grew up with was a Army paratrooper, right? He dove into combat zones in the middle of the night with people shooting at him. He skydives for fun on the weekends now, right? It's something that he does that actually he enjoys. He doesn't get that acute fear-based stress response from it. You get me in a plane and open the door, I'm shitting myself on the plane. it's not jumping out of the plane, right? It's the perception of jumping out of the plane that's going to cause the response you get physiologically and psychologically.
It's funny you say that because I've got a mate and he's a stoner, so he's addicted to marijuana. And talking about the perception thing, it's good. Like, he gets home from work and not that I'm condoning being a stoner at all, but he says he feels happy and stoned just going through the process of like packing the
Well, it's
bong,
mindful
chopping the weed
for him.
Even I got to say, when I'm prepping my coffee first thing in the morning, it already wakes me up. I already feel good before I even start drinking it. So it's funny that it works in the opposite way as well. And I guess we've all had those experiences like school camps. You go on a big swing or something, you're a bit nervous, and then you do it and you're like, oh, fuck, this is awesome.
Yeah, it's rituals and habits, right? And for most people, like, those are our anchors. And we do that all the time, and it's subcortical. And that the reason we do a lot of those things is because our brains actually shut off so that we can start using our cortex for more productive things, and we run amygdala driven, right? It's like when you drive home from work and you just wind up in your driveway and you don't remember actually driving, right? And you're like, did I stop at the stoplights? Did I like see anybody? Right? But it's because nothing novel happened. It's the same route you always take. Now, if somebody in front of you slams on their brakes, you're snapped right back into vigilance, right? And you get an acute stress response because of that. You get sympathetic. Threat goes away. The person, drives off, and you're right back into kind of your, losing yourself through the actual process. Athletes do the same thing. And again, this is something I found out in New York as well, right? When you walk down the streets of New York, and it's probably the same in Sydney and any big city, right? You see runners everywhere. Like, everybody runs in New York. It's something to do. And you see so many of them that they don't even register anymore when you're walking down the street, right? You've got your headphones in, you're just walking, you might be looking at your phone, 10 runners go past you, not a blip on the radar. Now, if a guy goes past you in a 3-piece suit sprinting, that snaps you to attention, right? Because that's out of context. That's novelty, right? So you get that acute stress response right there. You turn, you tense, you start looking. If he's hailing a cab, well, that's normal, and you go right back into your zone. If he's running from somebody or running after somebody, now you go into that fight or flight, and your body's trying to figure out which pathway to take, right? So novelty also plays a big picture, and that's perception of stress, right? Because everything's a stressor. Gravity's a stressor. Sunlight's a stressor, right? We're just so used to so many of them that they don't actually create a response that's going to do anything. It's immersion.
And what have you found? Because I've listened to you on a few other podcasts, and you were sort of in New York, working 7 days a week, living that sort of high stress life. What have you taken away from your daily routine, I guess, or some things, like some big changes you've made that you've found have really helped with this sort of thing?
Well, one is a big part of, for me, the thing that I was missing in New York the most was relationships. And, I think I was sleeping okay. I trained a lot. I was eating pretty healthy. I had a lot of NEAT, like I was taking 15 to 20,000 steps a day. So I probably had too much actual daily activity. But I was missing the relationships that I actually hold the dearest, right? I wasn't seeing my family near as much as I wanted to. And human beings are tribal by nature, right? And we are healthier when we are in groups. Right, we isolate people as punishments in maximum security prisons. That's all you need to know. Like, they take them out of like the general population with all the other convicts, and they put them in a room by themselves.
And then they form gangs.
So so it's like everything about humanity is tribal, and I wasn't seeing the people that I love the most. Right, I had a good group of friends in the city and people that I worked with, but I wasn't seeing my wife and kids nearly as much as I wanted to, and that was really weighing down on me. And that was probably the thing that was bothering me the most. And when we made the move out of New York and into the Midwest, a big part of that was for me to be able to work at home and be able to see my family more, right? And now I work, instead of 70 hours a week, I work, 35. Work 5 days a week. I don't work on weekends. I'm able to schedule myself basically between 9 and 4, Monday through Friday, and really control what I'm doing, right? But I'm working with 85 people, so it's just being able to time manage that and make it scalable. when you're in New York, you can't do that in a one-on-one environment all the time.
That's called living the dream, and it sounds like
Yeah.
Angus and I are stuck in your New York lifestyle right now.
Got it all figured out.
But I think we've got to be in this stage.
We're in
build
our
those
warrior phase.
relationships.
In your
Yeah,
20s, that's
in
your warrior
20s,
phase.
It's called working like an idiot, I think, and then building
Well,
something
and
respectable in your 30s. Or do you
Yeah,
disagree with it?
it's contrast. No, I don't. I actually think, the thing that probably bothers me the most is, 22-year-old trainers that have trained 200 sessions in person trying to build a remote business.
Oh, jeez.
Right? You know what I'm saying? Like that. And that's something that's very prevalent in the industry. And I think you have to have that contrast of just eating shit for a few years and working 7 days a week and
Yeah.
and training a ton of people, because otherwise you don't, like, if I didn't have that experience, I would not value my current experience nearly as much. I wouldn't know how good I have it, and I wouldn't be driving towards the things that I'm currently driving towards. And I really think if you don't go through that, especially in this industry, you just don't have the perception of the industry you probably need to have to actually be able to succeed. And every successful person that I've worked with has gone through those 3 to 5 to 6 year periods where they were just kind of crushed all the time. But that's where they got their experience. And so much of this industry, from an education standpoint, also happens outside of weekend seminars. You can have all the acronyms you want behind your name, but if you can't interact with people, you're still not going to be successful. You still have to be in the trenches, and you have to be able to talk to people.
Yeah, it's a real people person's job, and it's not something you can teach, like you were saying. It's something I think you're maybe brought up with. Like, our dad was a salesman. He always made us shake people's hand, look people in the eye from a young age, and interact. And a lot of people, and a guy we've had on the show, and we really respect him, Luke Tulloch. He's an amazing trainer. And he said he's a genius, and that was something he really had to work on, was the
because a lot of the people who are going to take the more cerebral approach to like learning the anatomy and learning why breathing's important, they're less likely to be people, and the people are the ones that are likely to have that success early on and be like, well, screw this, I'm just going to go into business development for PTs at 22 years old.
Yeah. At 22 years old, yeah. It only took me 16 years in the industry and managing 2,000 people at my last job, right? It's just, and I was one of those guys. I grew up in the rural Midwest and moved to New York when I was 23, and I'm a super introverted person by nature. And I was having panic attacks like my first week on the job. I was literally hiding in bathroom stalls so I didn't have to be on the training floor talking to people. Like, I've experienced that. Like, I've definitely been in that situation, and kind of had to just force myself out of that, because we frankly just couldn't afford to live in New York without me being successful. And that was hard, and that it is a skill set that I had to develop, and it definitely shaped a lot of the direction of the things that, I went into later on in my career post training.
No, it's very interesting. And yeah, like I said, I've been following you for a while, and those podcasts definitely where I'd like to see myself in 8 years' time, when I am around 36, mid to late 30s. It just sounds like a relaxing lifestyle.
I'm sure it's still got its stress.
Yeah, I'm sure you need your stress.
One of the topics I really wanted to dive into with you is asymmetry in the human body, and particularly hopefully a bit of a discussion on AFIR on the right side.
Can you explain that for me and the punters watching?
One of the first PRI concepts that I got introduced to is this idea, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're right side dominant, regardless of if you're left or right-handed, and that one of the most common pathologies that this leads to is a hip position where on the right side you got acetabulum directly over femur, and we rest in an internally rotated position. And we often don't have access to this position on the left side. One of the things I want to ask you about, Kyle, is this something that you think is present in absolutely everyone? Because that's sort of how it's been presented to me, or at least discussed with me. And then based off the idea that we have fundamental asymmetries in our body anyway, why is this problematic, this right side AFIR?
Yeah, you're basically just talking about, what we call the AIC pattern and PRI. And yeah, and you've got, A rotated pelvis, and that's actually usually caused by a rotated rib cage, right? And that's where you get different, basically different sizes of the lung lobes, and that affects how the diaphragm can descend and ascend. So that throws off your rib cage. And instead of kind of standing like this and being angled out, right? You can't see me on camera, but with that left shoulder forward and right back, we now have to rotate our pelvis to counter move that as a counter movement. So typically those two patterns, that BC pattern and that AIC pattern, they travel together. And it's funny because I always, when people ask me this, like on Instagram, like on Ask Me Anythings or whatever, I always, respond back to them and make them actually explain that to me in like real terms and not, not acronyms, just to see if they have an understanding of what it is before I start, talking about it.
Good work.
But yeah,
you passed.
you made it happen, right? You got it before I.
We'd only be lying to ourselves if you didn't know that.
But yeah, so you basically have, because of this pelvic position, you've got a right femur that doesn't externally rotate very well, and you've got a left femur that doesn't internally rotate very well. And because of this, you're always kind of shifting into that right hip. A large part of the population has this. You do have other patterns that present themselves with, bilateral extension. And typically people train themselves into that. Okay. That's what I see with a lot of power lifters, where they're just extended on both sides and they're completely externally rotated on both femurs.
So no internal rotation, and they've got that on both sides then.
Yeah, they've got that, really wide stance pattern. And again, look at the lifting that you're doing and the stances that you're taking up in powerlifting, right? You've got sumo stances, you've got wide stance squats. So you're feeding that pattern all the time. But the problem is you can't actually facilitate external rotation when you're already sitting at end ranges, right? So you have to have internal rotation to have usable external rotation. You have to have adduction to facilitate abduction. You have to have pronation to facilitate supination, right? So if somebody's stuck in that pattern, they're going to decrease the amount of torque that they can actually produce through that joint. And you're basically turning their hip into an elbow or a knee, right? It's no longer a ball and socket joint as much as it's just a flexion extension.
So then when you run into these people, like these powerlifters that are just stuck in extension and they've got these hinge joints instead of fully functioning hip joints and things like that, what are the strategies you go about to start restoring their frontal plane ability to get them moving well again? Or is it not so important for a powerlifter who only needs to be able to open up their hips? Is it more important for more field sports based people?
Well, and that's where we have to look at performance and health, right? Because for their lifts, it's not nearly as important. But I want them to be able to get out of that positioning all the rest of the time, right? So I'm going to train it. I'm just going to train it different ways. I'm going to look at more sensorial, tempo, low load, high volume based work, get them on one leg a little bit when it's appropriate. But before I even get into frontal plane, if they're in that extension pattern, I actually have to get sagittal competencies built up first, right? I have to find hamstrings instead of erectors, right? Abs instead of lats, right? Because most of those guys and girls, right, they are essentially stabilizing their pelvis and rib cage with hip flexors, lumbar extensors, and lats. And you can get some glutes in there too, because the glutes will facilitate extension in an anteriorly rotated pelvis, right? It doesn't have to be neutral for the glutes to find some sort of end range. They're not going to rotate under, so you're not going to get transverse fibers, but you can get the glute max in there through the majority of the range of motion. But what I need to find with those people is I need to find hamstrings and abs. So I'm switching that orientation where from the pelvis up, rather than their erectors and their lats stabilizing their pelvis, I'm going to try to get their abs to pull their ribs down and pull their pelvis up from an anterior standpoint, right? So we're closing the gaps there, right? And then from a posterior standpoint, I'm going to try to get their hamstrings to pull the pelvis down into a neutral position if you're coming from an anterior tilt.
And I see you do the drill a lot with a large med ball
in between the calf and hamstring with the ab roller. I actually tried that for the first time yesterday, and my hammies and abs I was going to put in my little training montage on Instagram today, and I was like, I just need to get a bit better at that. But I'm quite sore, like all through my abs as well. Like, sometimes you'll hit abs and like a certain section of your abs will be sore, but I'm sore sort of straight through, and my hammies are quite fatigued, and I consider my hamstrings quite strong. Like I can almost do unassisted Nordics, even though I'm probably in a lot of extension. Yeah, so now I think I might take myself back to a band and focus on like not going into too much extension. Is that something you would sort of recommend? Are these like principles you can play around with across a number of exercises?
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think the quality you're training in any of these exercises is also important, right? If you're training absolute strength, some extension is not a bad thing, right? Like I want you to be, as an athlete, like I want you to be able to access your hamstrings in extension, because you will be on the field in extension at some point, right? I also want you to be able to find a neutral position when you're off the field, right? And that's where I think, even with the PRI, group, they lean really far, again, it's a pendulum, right? So they're on the other side of things where you can't talk about variability, but also talk about anti-extension.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because extension is not bad, right? Being stuck in extension is bad. Those are two very different
super
things.
Extended looking guy. Like Usain Bolt is a super extended looking guy.
Oh yeah, exactly. I've never seen a high level sprinter that wasn't super extended. The fastest people, the most explosive athletes you'll ever see,
I think as David Gray
live in
said,
extension.
Nothing exciting happens in neutral.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I've never seen anything athletic happen in your heels, right? But that's how we've been taught to squat for the last 15 years. But if you play a field sport, like I was a basketball player, I might have spent 5% of a game in my heels. I'm on the balls of my feet for everything else, right? It definitely anything athletic, whether it's gait mechanics or jumping, I'm in the balls of my feet. And as soon as I shift into my heels, I'm no longer athletic because my rib cage is too far back in space. You have to be sagittal to produce power too, right? So again, I think all of this is so nuanced that as soon as we start making rules that are absolute, we're wrong, right? And I think you have to be objective enough to say, hey, this PRI-based neutral position is really good for health. And if I'm walking down the street, if I'm playing with my kids on the playground, even whatever, like this is probably a good position to be in. But if I'm on a basketball court, I need to be able to facilitate every position, because there's like it's all reactive, right? I have to be able to move in extension, flexion, lateral extension and flexion, different rotation patterns, different stances. You also never jump with both feet in a perfect bilateral stance, right? That never happens either, right? We've got that inverted Y. We're jumping off one leg. So you have these rules that it's good to be able to meet the fundamental patterns, but you also have to be able to get out of them and access other patterns and to be able to perform in those patterns. So true variability isn't flexion or extension. It's being neutral and being able to access both spectrums. And, I love PRI because it definitely changed the way that I move and the way that I feel, but I was also coming from a very extension-based posture.
It's funny.
But once I got,
Sorry, go on, Carl.
Oh no, I was just saying once I got into like that neutral, I got to the point where I was building up different contraindications from trying to tuck my tailbone under all the time, and trying to find different, that posture and trying to maximize that. I was losing performance and building up different contraindications during other activities.
It's interesting though, because I've been using a lot of this PRI stuff as a warm-up strategy, but now through this conversation, maybe what I'm starting to realize is there more to gain from it in a cool down phase, so that I'm not walking around like taking my workout with me throughout the rest of my day.
See, I'm the opposite of you. I've only been doing it at the end of my day and the end of my workout.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I do a little bit of both, and here's the cycle that I usually go through. Like I'm usually coming into a gym session pretty vigilant. Like I'm pretty sympathetic. So I need to dampen a little bit just so I can get some kind of competency. Like I need to be able to find my hamstrings if I'm going to go squat or deadlift or do whatever. So I'll spend about 5 minutes going through a dampening phase. But then I try to turn on the switch and go through a neural prep, right? Where I'm doing plyometrics, I'm doing med ball slams, I'm doing high velocity work to then again ramp up my nervous system just with better positioning for motor recruitment. So that I can go into my output lift. But when I'm when I'm squatting, I'm doing my big lifts, like I'm not thinking about position. And I think for most people, if you're doing a strength-based movement with that type of intensity, right, you don't want to be thinking about anything. Like I don't want to feel anything necessarily. I just want to move the weight and complete the task. And if I'm not able to do that, that means I'm probably not ready for the load, right? Again, so you have to have the appropriate exercise selection and the appropriate intensity for this to be valuable. If you're just overloading athletes, and you're kind of fucked either way, right? It doesn't really matter at that point. So if I'm picking the right intensity, if I'm picking the right exercises, I shouldn't have to think about it. It should be unconscious competence at that point, right? Now, when I get into my accessory work and I get into my sensorial stuff, that's when I will try to think more about position because I'm doing much lower intensity, higher volumes, a lot of time under tension. I'm thinking more about planar mechanics and hypertrophy and stability. So I think you can kind of break down your typical training session into different qualities where you use different strategies. And you can get the best of both worlds if you do that.
Yeah, something I've been doing, and I would say exactly how I've been structured. So I usually walk in the gym. I might jump on the bike depending if I haven't been on my feet and how early it is in the day. Then I'll go through like 5 minutes worth of different ISO holds. So I might do a hang, focusing on tucking my hips under. I might do a hamstring bridge, same thing, hips under, trying to engage my abs. And they'll do one of Jake Turo's ISO holds. So I like the one where you're sort of in a split lunge and then you're on your forefoot. And then I also like the one where your tailbone's on a wall, you're on the ball of your feet, and you're in like a quarter squat. So your torso alignment is the same as your shin alignment. And then I'll go into like my classic mobility. And then towards the end of the session, I'll get into my PRI breathing stuff like 90-90 hip lift, and then the bear breathing into the upper back. And then I've also been doing the Tommy John spinal hygiene every night before bed. And earlier in the year, I was doing, my program hasn't changed. It's always a lot of sprinting, some jumps, and a bit of Olympic lifting mixed in with weights. And I sort of spasmed my back 3 times to sort of, I guess, around May to June. And that's when I started all this stuff. And I can't pinpoint exactly what it was because I started everything at the same time. But nothing's happened. Like my back feels bulletproof, and I've just pulled a lifetime equal PB.
The most uncontrolled experiment.
I know. I should have triggered it in because I really don't know which.
It's like it's like an elimination diet. We'll have you start just taking things out and seeing what the back goes. Next time you get hurt, we'll know what it was, right?
But I just don't want to risk it because I just feel so great.
No, I've done the exact same sort of thing because I've discovered sort of all this stuff at once. So I'm sort of similar strategy going into the gym as you, just get myself out of extension. But then the 2 other things that I really have trouble with, trying to find my big toe. And then I spend some time trying to, in a push-up position, trying to find, like, get some weight through my thumb and second finger again.
Find some pronation there. Yeah, I think, and again, for me, you guys are describing like different strategies, like a pre and post, like respiration thing. And my question, like if I was working with you guys as clients, like my question would be, are the outcomes where you want them?
For sure, at the moment.
Because if they are, I'm not changing anything. And I think, again, that's another industry thing where, sometimes I think trainers feel like, or coaches or whoever, feel like they have to change something just to kind of validate their position there. But for me, it's a similar, like when I work with powerlifters, like, right, if they're an extension, but they're not in pain during their lifts and they haven't reached a point of diminishing returns on their lifts, I'm going to let them ride that wave until we start actually getting to a point where they're plateauing or they're experiencing some kind of pain. And then we'll make an adjustment. But I don't need to preemptively change something that's not broken. And for you guys, it's the same thing. Like at the end of the day, like, we're all ends of one, right? And I think the whole like science-based versus evidence-based argument is just total bullshit, right? Like I've been through, collegiate research schooling. I'm in a master's program now for behavioral psychology, and all I'm talking about is research. And what people don't understand about these studies is they're in completely controlled environments with controlled
I'm so
variables.
sick of this evidence-based
Like,
movement. Like,
right, like
where is the study on
none
the
of that shit
90-90 hip
matters on
lift?
a
It makes me feel good.
exact yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like none of that shit matters like on a training floor anyway, or on a soccer field or whatever, right? So at the end of the day, like I want athletes that can perform. I want, clients in the gym pop spectrum that can walk up and down steps without knee pain. I don't always care how they get there. I care about the outcome because it's my job to produce outcomes. Like I've got plenty of clients who started training with me very early on or came to me from other coaches who still foam roll and stretch. And again, like they get off of that foam roller, they get off of that stretching, and they feel better.
And
I don't need to take it away just because my bias is with something
But
else
this is exactly what we're seeing, especially from physios now, because we've got this, again, evidence-based physiotherapist scene emerging, and they neuter themselves almost by only sticking to practices that have systematic reviews and thousands of studies backing them. And I understand how that feels safe and comfortable, but like you say, at the end of the day, it's about the outcomes, not about being evidence-based. And if being evidence-based facilitates the outcome, then that's good. But just what I've seen is people doing things that make them feel good, and then people are removing the tools from those people just because they're not backed by all these papers. Because I'm with you there, like static stretching, I know that it's not lengthening any muscle tissues or things like that, but it feels good. For my clients who do it, I haven't removed it from them because it's still them spending 5 minutes exploring their body and just getting out of that work headspace when they come into the gym.
Well, and that's the big thing. Like from a psychological perspective, you also have to think about, especially Gen Pop, right? A lot of our clients have never been fit. They're trying to get fit. And because of that, the gym space is usually a pretty intimidating one, right? So for most of them, they're coming into the gym space with a lot of anxiety. And for a lot of the people that I've worked with, being able to go kind of sit in a corner by a wall and roll around on a foam roller and look at the room and see who's in there and get familiar with the space actually does a lot more to just dampen their nervous system and increase their familiarity with the gym than something else might, right? Because again, perception of your environment, and that's where we get into like the biopsychosocial model, is also going to God, it's late here, I'm sorry, but it's going to impact the way that you perform within the environment. Like we all know that as an athlete, if you're super nervous, if you've got a lot of anxiety, you're not going to perform as well as you are if you're comfortable. And one of the biggest things that I always try to remind people is, it's the people that are really good at training also seem to really like training. And I think that's probably more meaningful than we think it is. We kind of think about it as a chicken before the egg conversation, but I think the love of training probably has a lot more to do with being good at it than being good at it has to do with loving it. And again, one of the examples that I've used in the past with people is, if you go to a nightclub and you go out on a dance floor, you're going to see all kinds of people who are deconditioned, out of shape, have all kinds of knee pain and ankle pain and back pain or whatever, but they're out there dancing, having fun, moving in 3D planes.
A couple
right?
of beers does wonders for your left side internal rotation.
Listen, man, it loosens you up a little bit, right? So they're in an environment they enjoy. They're chasing something, right? That 2:00 call. So you got some dopamine in the system as well. And then you've also, you've lubricated the system a little bit with some alcohol and maybe some other stuff. And these people are moving like they've got nothing wrong with them, but you see them in the gym.
Inhibitions at the door.
Yeah, you see them in a gym the next day, and they're limping up to a treadmill, looking sad and depressed, and not feeling, and their knee hurts right before they even get on it. So what is that, right? What is that? Is that the environment, or is that the perception of what they're doing from a task standpoint? Because psychology will feed physiology every time.
That's true. So is that sort of where you find yourself now? Like you've gone from, like you've
it seems like you've studied a lot of systems, and like systemic approaches are nice because I think they help us sort of be consistent. But then, like you say, to truly acknowledge the biopsychosocial model, it almost seems like what you've done now is you've just thrown all the stuff into a toolbox and you just sort of trial it case by case on each client to see sort of what they get into.
Yeah, I mean, they're all tools, right? And from a client standpoint, I want them to genuinely enjoy what they're doing, because without intention, like, none of this stuff's going to work. It doesn't matter. And because of that, they're not going to stick with the program. And now they're not getting fit, and I'm not able to help them, and we have to go find more clients, right? So it hurts my business as well. So we can create win-wins a lot of the times just by doing things that our clients like. And I think the application of the tool really matters. And the skill of the practitioner or the coach, for me, is much more important than the actual methodology that they're using. Long before PRI, when I was doing SFMA and a bunch of other shit, DNS and FRC and whatever, I helped a lot of people get better. And I never once explored an AIC pattern. I never once talked about breathing into their posterior rib cage, right? These things they're great. They're good strategies, but they're not necessary for somebody to get better, right? And I think there's a lot of different roads that you can take, but I think the client enjoying what they're doing is probably more impactful a lot of times than the road they're walking down.
It's funny though, but because like I understand that instinct we have as humans. Like the week I learned about all this PRI stuff, and then I see someone in a couch stretch the next day, and I would be like, "It's not going to work." But it's like you've got to let them do it. Like,
You're an idiot.
Just act like I wasn't doing that stuff a month ago. You know what I mean? And it's like, and like I say, I definitely got some positive outcomes out of it. I don't know whether it was because I bought into it or maybe I just exposed myself to some new positions, but like there was something to it, right?
Oh yeah, man. I get trolled all the time online by people who like just took their first Myokin seminar. Yeah. And I'm like, man, I'm like literally 7 years ahead of you in this process, right? Like it's cool. Like I get it that you just learned this in 2 days and you're super high up on it, and that's awesome. Like that's great. I'm glad you're excited. But you have to understand the journey that I've been on as well, as far as I've been through those courses. I've got the home study on my computer. I can review it anytime that I want to. And I've also been to all the other additional courses, or at least a good deal of them. And I've also been on a lot of different training floors, working with a lot of different people. And it's great that, in a perfect world, we're going to have everybody lie on the ground and breathe through balloons. But if you're trying to do that in a gym floor in New York City with 1,000 other people in the room, that's not going to happen. They're not going to have the attention or intention to get anything out of that. Meanwhile, they're a weight loss client that wants to lose 30 pounds and you've had them on the floor for 45 minutes. Do you think they're even coming back?
In the end, you got to run.
You know what I'm saying? Like it's just, like, and you're not helping them. Like, what are you doing? Like the biggest way you can improve that person's movement is by them losing weight. Yeah. Then you can get into the technical stuff. Like, let's hit the low hanging fruit before we start getting into some of this more technical stuff, And like, I know complexity sells, but again, I think too many people are using it as water. A confusion. Yeah, it's exactly. Like, let's just try to walk more than 2,000 steps a day. Let's try to drink 30 ounces of water a day and maybe try to sleep more than 4 hours and see where we're at, right? Like, people, I think a lot of coaches, and myself included sometimes, like, I forget that the gym is something we made up. Like, it's a game. It's a very arbitrary game, right, that we entertain ourselves with, that in an ideal world, my job wouldn't exist, right? Like there's a reason there were no trainers 300 years ago.
Everyone was getting around.
Like,
too many distractions now.
Just throwing rocks at shit.
Yeah. Even like sports, right? Like, we pay athletes millions and millions of dollars, but the first sports were generated literally because different tribes were losing too many of their males in war, and they weren't able to procreate, right? Like, that's literally where they came from. They're like, how can we compete and assert dominance with this other tribe without losing half our males? Let's play lacrosse, or let's run races. yeah, like let's do one of these other
MMA has
things.
kind of brought us full circle, whereas now we're using these performance strategies to go back to trying to kill each other again.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I'm looking forward to
so
the
now we're
animals.
combining
The
two
animals
things.
being added in with the humans again. Then we really go back.
It's only a matter of time. We're going to go right back to
Oh, it's
Centurions.
happening for sure. Carl, we've really appreciated your time, and it's late over there. And after that conversation, I want to make sure you have time to calm down after this exciting interview and get a good 8 hours sleep. But we've just got our scripted questions, and the first one is: who are your 5 favorite athletes of all time?
Who are the most
Oh, man.
five
So I've
favorite
got
neutral athletes?
Yeah.
probably none of them. So for me, I grew up in like the golden age of basketball, right? But I was actually a huge Scottie Pippen fan rather than a Michael Jordan
Nice.
fan. So he was like my guy growing up. I was a big basketball fan, obviously.
I respect
I was a
that
huge
answer
fan of
so
Bo
much.
Jackson.
That Scottie Pippen over Jordan.
Yeah.
Love that. I'm Dennis Rodman over Jordan, but that's a story for another day.
Okay, good. Bo Jackson, just
Beast.
because he was a complete freak of nature. Oh, gosh, I was a huge fan of young Shaquille O'Neal because he was also an absolute like Magic era
Before
Shaquille
he
O'Neal.
stacked on like that extra 30 pounds of muscle and fat.
Yeah,
Really
but
leaned into his strengths. Hey,
Yeah.
he did, but like young Shaquille O'Neal running down the court full speed at like 260 pounds was like something to behold. I would. Oh, who was I just thinking about? Deion Sanders
Freak.
was a big guy for me.
The perm, when he had the
And
perm
then,
was all time.
I just like, I mean, he was another one. Like, I usually don't like arrogant athletes, but he was just so good. He got away with it, and it just didn't matter, right? Michael Johnson
Nice.
was probably my favorite track
super
athlete. Talk about
Yeah,
extension.
correct.
Yeah, but again, it's like I was just getting into track and field with like the Atlanta Games in 1996, and I ran the 400. So he was my
the
dude.
shit.
how do you feel about Conor McGregor?
and then-
Because he's like super lordotic, super cocky, super anteriorly tilted scaps. He must really set you off.
Honestly, man, if he functions like that, I don't even
true.
care, right? I get it. You know, for me, that's one of the biggest things is when I walk into a gym, I see all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't necessarily do myself, but I also don't disagree with it, right? And I try to be really objective, and I try to question my own beliefs probably more so than I would question anybody else's as often as possible, because I've been wrong more than I've been right throughout my career. And I think, you know, again, if that wasn't true, I wouldn't be where I am now. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So
There you go. I think that was 5. That was a good 5. I like
That's
it. I
very
like
solid.
the Scottie Pippen over Jordan because usually everyone goes for Jordan or LeBron. Angus, do you want to hit Carl with the next question?
Do you have a party trick?
one that I can list here.
This is open space. You can talk about anything. Angus and I regularly talk about shooting ourselves. Well, not that regularly. More regularly than we should. Yeah.
Just on the
Yeah.
weekends. I was actually notorious in college from basically just like walking home from all the parties because I would just get sick of
I've got a
being at
mate
them.
who does that. Nick Grange loves to just unannounced, just walk home from a party, shoes off.
Like my roommates literally called me Huck Finn for over 2 years because I wound up at home with no shoes once, didn't know where they were, just barefoot for like 4 miles, 2 a.m.
There you go. That's a
So-
party trick.
I relate to
Smoke
that.
bomb, barefoot walking home.
That's my new thing. My new
It's the
rule is
latest.
don't say
It's
goodbye to
functional,
people
right?
at parties. Just get out. Smoke
Just
bomb every
leave,
time.
Yeah.
Because it just creates more stress.
I would just walk out.
Yeah.
I would just walk out. You know, it's but yeah, it's probably the lamest party trick you guys have heard, but
That's
that's
right.
probably
Better than
the
Will
closest thing.
Crozier's just having a thick neck.
Yeah.
Got a
He has a big
26-inch neck.
All right, our next question is who is a rapper you would have rap about you, and what would they say?
I don't know what they'd say. I would probably go old school, like my guy was Tupac way back in the day. Again, it's like I always think we go back to the music that we came up with like in middle school and high school. I think that's what resonates the most with us. So I had a lot of Tupac and then a lot of Nas in my life at that point. And Oh man, I have no idea what they'd say.
Angus? Angus is a
Probably nothing
ex-musician,
nice.
so he'll think something up.
I'll try to
He's
think of
also a
something.
bit of a poet.
Not
Yeah.
very good at rhyming. We'll see. It's nothing's coming to me today.
No, you're too much of a calm guy, Kyle.
I'm just.
You don't have any
Were you
aggression
an
for the
angry
rap
kid?
game.
Did you get it all out of your system at one point?
I actually was kind of an angry kid, and that's I mean, especially like my college experience. I had a lot of dark days, especially through all my injuries, and wasn't sober much.
Probably went
And
hands in hand.
yeah,
with the
now
injuries.
it wasn't a great time in my life, but now it's
Nice.
definitely much calmer.
And last
much
question,
calmer.
Angus. The Sure Challenge.
If you could turn back time, what would you change?
Oh,
And if you say nothing, Angus and I
This-
have
would
to
that's a
talk
cop-out.
about something
That's
we
a cop
regret.
out. Yeah.
No, so we take the grunt.
no. I would probably actually change a lot of the lifestyle coherence things that people are doing now, like the blue blockers and the toe shoes and all that shit, and
I
that
actually bought some
that-
tissues,
that's,
but I can explain myself.
it's
No, I was
it's okay,
getting
it's
rash.
okay.
I like warming up barefoot before I go into spikes on the synthetic turf, and this turf was cutting into my skin. So I was like, can't wear socks because I'll slip. So I ordered some Vibrams to my neighbour's address, and I just hid them quickly in my bag.
Well, again, it's context, right? Because I mean, one of my favorite things about New York was, you're living literally in the most stimulated environment possible, and you think that blue blockers and 5 minutes of meditation a day and five-toed shoes are actually going to like do anything, right? So that was even the context of that more so than anything else. Alkaline
Oh, that
water,
kills
shit
me.
like that.
Lime
the
salt
best.
water when you wake up every morning? Have you heard that stitch up?
I have, and I drink a cup of coffee.
Me
Usually is
too.
the first
Black
thing I drink
coffee,
in the
best
morning.
thing out
So
of bed.
black coffee. That's about where
That's
I'm at.
exactly how I start my day. So I'm glad to hear I'm on the path to being like Kyle Dobbs. I got 8 years, and that's how I plan on living my life, guys.
Similar sort of hair profiles coming in here. Got the facial hair and the top.
Yeah, I got the facial hair. My beard's pretty patchy though. Oh, here's the last thing. Let's end it here before you shout out your socials, where everyone can find you and everything like that. Because we've had a consistent 150 people tuning in, so they haven't asked any questions. They're very lazy chat today. I think they've just enjoyed the
I
conversation.
think they've just been sitting there speechless trying to keep up with some
Correct.
of these concepts.
Kyle, I'm getting married in
Yeah.
4 months. You're a happily married man. What's a bit of advice for me moving forward into marriage?
For a neutral marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you the same thing my dad told me. Never go to bed angry.
I already adopted that, so I like that I'm
So
on the
Oscar's
right
going to
path.
be getting a lot of 4-hour sleeps.
Yeah, explaining myself. I'm sorry, baby. The list of apologies. All right, cool. All right, Kyle, thanks for coming on. You're a guy we're going to love to have on the show. Forward down the track for sure, if you're willing and you haven't hated us
Still
too much.
many unanswered questions.
Yeah, many others. Shout out your IG. I've actually put it on Twitch, so guys, make sure if you're tuning now, you can find Kyle's Instagram there, and then I think you have your link tree that connects to your websites and everything.
Yeah. So Instagram's the easiest place to find me. It's just compound performance
Nice.
_ And then, my link tree links to the website and everything else. So that's
Nice,
definitely
guys.
the way to
Alright,
go.
there it is, episode 144 in the can. Guys, make sure you check out that. As you can see, it's a gloomy day here in Sydney, so nice day to be tuning into our Twitch. If you want to listen to it again, this will be on our Twitch for the next month, and then it will be on our YouTube on Monday, and it'll be on all podcast platforms Monday. Kyle, you're the man.